Usually when you see a team like the Philadelphia Phillies, the way the Philadelphia Phillies have been since 2022, that's a team that wins a championship. I mean, to come out of really nowhere in 2022 and shock everyone by going as far as they did, beating everyone they did on the way there, then pulling a deja vu on the Atlanta Braves, and looking like they were going to steamroll to not just another World Series appearance, but they were going to go all the way this time. I mean, this team had everything going for them. The talent, the ability to be clutch, the vibes, what's largely looked at as the best home field in baseball. The Phillies are easily at the top in home crowds during October, just like you can easily hit that subscribe button if you haven't already and enjoy the videos. The hostile and crazy energy is insane, and the reason we didn't hear much of that for years is because the Phillies weren't in the playoffs for years. That is until 2022 when we were reintroduced to the October Philly crowd. And for the last couple of years, Philly has become known as that loudest, most hostile environment in baseball, and what we've seen is for that to be the case with the visiting team. You come into Philly, the crowd's on you quick, the Phillies offense gets going, everyone's going nuts, and it's just a visitor's nightmare. So after the Phillies won both games 1 and 2 against Arizona last year in the playoffs, it was pretty clear that this series probably wasn't going back to Philly. And if by some miracle it did, the Phillies were going to win the series in 6. I felt that, you felt that, everyone felt that, but it didn't matter what we felt in the end because that miracle did end up happening, but not just the miracle of getting this series back to Philly. The D-backs took 2 of 3 at home before winning games 6 and 7 in front of a stunned Citizens Bank Park. Absolutely nobody on this planet thought this would happen, yet it did, and this was such a big plot twist because it was lining up kind of perfect for the Phillies before. They go on a magical run in 2022 and just fall short, but 2023 they're right back at it, so this was clearly the redemption arc. But to lose the way they did felt so weird. It felt like that was their opportunity and they blew it. Like, could they be able to get back to this position again this far? Well, there is something the Phillies never did in the 2022 and 2023 seasons among the many things that they did do, and that's win the division. The Braves entered the 2024 season with 6 straight NL East division titles, but thanks to half the team getting injured and the Phillies simply playing better overall, the Phillies ended up on top this year by season's end, finishing 6 games ahead of both the Braves and Mets by winning 95 games and their first division crown since 2011. They started off the year pretty amazing. Like, the 2024 Phillies at one point looked flawless. From every standpoint of the team, no matter where you looked, everyone was having a career year. It was pretty absurd. Looking back, there was one stretch in a year where they kind of felt a little down to earth. The month of July was a little lousy for them, but overall, they were a really good team. Or were they? The 2024 first half Phillies were a great team. They went into the All-Star break about 30 games over 500. Everyone was cooking, but if you look at what happened in the second half, they weren't a bad team, let me get that out of the way, but things were not the same, clearly. The record would tell you that, considering they were a 500 team exactly in the second half at 33 and 33. But there's also a ton of players who regressed in the second half, either compared to what they were in the first half or just in general. They sucked. Bryson Stott did not have a good year at all offensively. He provided speed on the bases, but that was it. And the same goes for Johan Rojas. Fast, steals some bases, but not a good hitter. But what about the big guns, the main characters of this Phillies team? The Bryce Harpers, Trey Turners, Kyle Schwarbers of the world, etc. Well, Schwarber was great the whole year. He deserves the most credit out of anyone on this Phillies team from a consistency standpoint. He popped almost 40 home runs and didn't have any fall off in the second half. In fact, he was even better. Nick Castellanos had a much better second half than a first half. JT Realmuto dealt with knee issues this year, but still was able to put up a productive offensive season. Everyone else, second half fall offs. Trey Turner had an awesome first half, terrible second half. Alec Boehm, really good first half, fell off a cliff in the second half. Brandon Marsh, same thing, big drop off. Even Bryce Harper, his second half numbers weren't bad, but it was still a big change to what he was before the All-Star break. And none of this is obviously comforting to see, considering the Phillies' bats going cold is a massive part in why they collapsed against Arizona last year. The pitching had a couple of these second half issues as well, but it wasn't nearly as bad and frequent. Ranger Suarez is the worst example. Started off pitching like a Cy Young Award winner, only to start dealing with back issues, and when he did take them out in the second half, he got crushed. Taijuan Walker was just bad, period, from start to finish, but this pitching overall took a big step forward this year, and I would say is pretty obviously the reason the Phillies won the most most games in a season since 2011. Zach Wheeler is an absolute stud and keeps looking like he's going to go down as one of the best pitchers in baseball history without a Cy Young award to show for it. I mean, he's an absolute dog. 34 years old, pumping heat, making every start, racking up innings, striking people out. He's awesome. Wheeler threw exactly 200 innings. Aaron Nola pitched almost exactly the same, and he was good. Christopher Sanchez in his first full season as a big league starter was really good. And the Phillies also had something they hadn't had in a long time: a lights out bullpen. They had 3 guys with an ERA either in the low 2s or under 2. Jeff Hoffman and Matt Strahm, who are both in their early 30s and years into their big league careers, had literal career years and were named to their first All-Star teams. And then you had the complete opposite of a player in Orion Kerkering, almost 10 years younger than both, in his first big league season, and he was great. So that's another big improvement and change from the last few years. A 3-headed monster in the bullpen, but also just the overall pitching staff being so great. That's why they finished where they did. The offense overall was good too, but like I went over, there were regressions as the season moved on, and the pitching overall really stayed strong. Now, does the offense regressing in the second half necessarily translate to how they'll do in the postseason? No. I would throw everything out the window once October starts, but I think if things continued the way they were left off, you can look at some correlation. And, well, I mean, maybe there was some correlation. So the Phillies went on a finally match up with someone else in the NLDS, but it was still an in-division rival, now being the Mets. And the Mets this year remind me a lot of the 2022 Phillies, a team that nobody gave much thought of because of other sexier teams in the NL East like the Braves, but a team full of personalities that powered through, came through clutch and big to make the postseason before proceeding to go on a magical run. I mean, that seems like the 2024 Mets in a nutshell right now. And here's where things get weird with how I felt about this series. Before the Mets-Phillies series, my prediction was that the Mets would pull a Phillies on the Phillies. I know that might sound confusing, hang with me here. What I mean by that is that the Mets would play the role of the 2022/2023 Phillies, and the Phillies would play the role of the 2022/2023 Braves. In 2022 and 2023, the Braves were heavily favored to win. On paper, they had the better, more talented team, finished way ahead of them in the standings, only for the Phillies to take them out in 4 games, splitting the first 2 in Atlanta before winning games 3 and 4 in front of a raucous Philly crowd. I mean, is that not how 2024 was being set up if you look at it that way? The Phillies are the division winners, playing with home field against the underdog scrappy Mets who just snuck into the playoffs. It's the exact same story, just now the Phillies are at the worst end of it. Kyle Schwarber started the series off how he's basically started every playoff game for the Phillies the last few years, hitting an absolute shot to immediately give the Phillies a 1-0 lead. Zach Wheeler did his job, throwing 7 shutout innings, can't ask for anything more than that, but through those 7 innings, the Phillies were still only up 1-0. They didn't do anything offensively after that home run by Schwarber. He was the only guy to do anything the whole game, so things overall were going Phillies' way, but that was only because the Mets hadn't done absolutely anything at that point. So because their pitching was also locked down, all it would take for them was one little rally and the Mets have the advantage. And if you had been paying attention to the Mets at all recently, you know that, if anything, they are at their best when they're down in the game. And while watching this, you had to just know the Mets were not going to go down without a fight. I mean, when Zach Wheeler goes 7 strong innings and you have arguably the best bullpen in baseball, you pretty obviously don't lose that game. But none of that mattered in the case of the Mets. This is a special team. And lo and behold, they get to a couple of the best Philly relievers that I mentioned not too long ago to score 5 runs in the 8th inning and win the game 6-2. And ironically, the one game they ended up losing in this series was a game that they led early on. I talked about how the Mets had been good when late in the game, and that can't be more true. They came back late in Atlanta to make the playoffs to begin with, then won 2 games in Milwaukee, a game 1 which they trailed early, and then a decisive game 3 which they were 2 outs away from losing. So after yet another comeback in game 1, of course being up 3-0 in the 6th inning didn't work out for them. But even in the Phillies coming back, the Mets still looked like they were going to come up clutch and stay winning in the end, tying the game late with Mark Vientos' second 2-run homer of the game, but Nick Castellanos, who had also ended up having a big day, would walk it off. But hey, this was still lining up with my pre-series thoughts. I didn't think the Mets were going to sweep Philly. I did think Philly would take a game at home and head to New York with high hopes, just like Atlanta had done for the last 2 years, winning game 2 and feeling like they have all the momentum going on the road. But it turns out they did not have the momentum at all. I mentioned the Phillies playing to almost 30 games over 500 in the first half of this season and then exactly 500 for the second half. Well, the Mets had a record just 3 games over 500 heading into the All-Star break. After, with the power of OMG, Francisco Lindor, Grimace, Hawk Tua, and others, the Mets rode their way to a record over 13 games over 500 in the second half. They've had the best momentum in baseball for a while now, other than Detroit, I guess, and that's really what baseball is about at the end of the day when it comes to winning championships. It's all about who gets hot and when. And right now, the Mets are simply that team. Just like the Phillies were in 2022 and 2023, the Mets are now. And ironically, the Phillies are on the bad end of the scenario. So the Mets jumping out and scoring a ton of runs and winning Game 3 7-1, not surprising. And even though the Mets couldn't scratch home a run through 5 innings in Game 4, it ended just like Game 1 did. But instead of the Mets scoring on several hits, all it took was one swing of the bat from the man who's led this team the entire way, the man who owns me, Francisco Lindor, sending a baseball into the Philly bullpen for a grand slam, and right then it became official. At least for me it did. This game was over. This series was over. And in the end, the Mets fulfilled my prophecy. They Phillied the Phillies. And the Phillies are going home really early this year. Last year's end felt so weird, largely because of how shocking it was and how sure it seemed the Phillies were gonna win. It felt more like a tragedy, a rug being pulled from underneath everyone. But this year, it feels more like a funeral, because last year's ending was bad. But it was like a long bad, it lasted a while, you weren't really sure how it was going to end, and then bam, it was over, and it was just like, what? But this year ended up with a quick beating by the hands of the Mets, an in-division rival, and the season also ends with tons of questions moving forward. They already have such a veteran team, most of this team isn't built necessarily for the future, so the future doesn't necessarily look bleak for this Phillies team, but it looks unclear. And for now, a long winter lies ahead for a team that once again had so much promise, so much energy, only to look like the very thing they made the Braves look like for the last 2 years. Dead in front of a very happy, raucous crowd on the road, this time being in Queens, New York. And 2024 is a complete failure for the Phillies. Let me know your thoughts and thank you for watching.